The longer that I'm involved in the art of preaching, the more I catch myself thinking this. These readings for today are difficult, and it doesn't matter what the readings are. It just seems that they're always difficult. And maybe it's because I've studied them so often, and sometimes I wonder if I have anything new or anything important that I need to share about them. And as you've heard the readings for today is hardly different. The subject matter is so familiar to us. We all have been exposed to the law of God since we were baby Christians, whether we were baptized as infants or we were baptized later in life. Whatever the time was, from then on we begin learning about the law of God. And though the law, especially the commandments, are so familiar to us, occasionally we need to review what we know and what we don't know about them. For though they're familiar, they're both simple in form, but deeply complex in meaning. Now, we could look at the 10 Commandments and make a checklist. And we can all make one or another claim like, well, I never did that. Or at least I haven't done it lately. But then when we come to this passage from the Sermon on the Mount, we begin to wrestle with the deeper meaning of what those commandments mean. Jesus is taking us into a deep dive about those words, and so we can begin to discover exactly what's life-giving and life-enhancing about them. And it requires some careful thought and careful study so we don't misinterpret the actual intent of the commandments. And we don't reduce them to something that's some kind of moral legalism. Now, a few short verses before this particular passage, we heard Jesus say this: "Do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've come not to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until it's all accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of these least of the commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven." And so Jesus is asking his followers to trust the scriptures and to rely on them and to love them. And remember that at the time that these sayings were written down, that this was put together, the Gospels were not completely written yet. The epistles were not completely written yet. The thing that the people had was the law and the prophets, and they built their understanding on what Jesus said and also on what they knew from the law and the prophets. So they're not to be dismissed as being obsolete. Those scriptures are not irrelevant for us either. Jesus wants to instruct us in the deeper truths that lay within their teachings. And it's out of this kind of an understanding that he lays before us a series of sayings that begin like this: "You have heard it said, but I say." So in this series of sayings, Jesus wants us to apply ourselves to living in relationships that are life-giving and life-enhancing. He never contradicts the law, but he deepens it. He goes that mile further. And living this way is harder than simply living by that list of rules and laws. It's easy to say, "I didn't murder anyone." But it's harder to refrain from anger and insults. It's easy to say, "I didn't commit adultery today," but it's harder to avert your eyes from an attractive person and might be even harder to change your thought pattern once you've seen them. It's so much easier to live by a list of rules and laws than it is to live in this authentic, dynamic kind of way. Laws can be static and arbitrary. They can seem to leave us with yes and no choices. Yes, guilty. No, innocent. But Jesus reached into the law as was given in the Torah and wanted to reveal its true objective, the idea that we need to value and protect the people around us. For instance, it's not simply enough to say no killing, no murder, but rather than simply refrain from killing, the point is to do something positive, to learn to value the people around you, to learn to value your enemies even, to learn to look at them as the children of God that each and every one of us is. What is required is that we not only fail to do them harm, but that we engage proactively seeking their good, even sometimes to the risk of our own good. And so, obeying the commandments in the way that they're intended begins with us. And we hear that in this reading when Jesus says, "So, when you bring your gift to the altar and you remember that a brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift at the altar. It'll be there when you come back. But leave it at the altar and first go be reconciled with the person that you're having a problem with." And we dare not wait for that person to come to us before we act, because they may never seek us out. But if we know that there's a difficulty there that needs to be addressed, we need to offer our hand to go forward and try to reconcile. Jesus tells us we can't even worship well until we have made that step redemptively toward another with whom we are in conflict. And that is exactly what our exchange of peace is about at every communion service that we celebrate. It's the time to make amends, the time to say, "I'm sorry, forgive me." It's the time that follows our confession and absolution, and it's the time to begin the reconciliation with the one you may have hurt. It's time to solidify those good connections and relationships that we need to have with each other. And it's time to celebrate the peace with God and the peace with those around us. Now, there's a challenge regarding adultery and divorce that can be easily reduced to moralism and self-discipline. But there's more at work here than what happens at first glance. First of all, this passage serves to recognize that the culture of that time had reduced women to the status of property and the sources of male satisfaction. And that's why in this reading the pronouns are masculine. Jesus very bluntly and repeatedly elevates the status of women far above what was generally accepted at that time. In that setting, women were indeed property, first owned within their own family of birth. Their father had that kind of jurisdiction over them. And then once they married, they're owned by the husband and could be dealt with in ways that were necessary according to what the husband thought was good and proper. The woman, the wife, had no similar privilege. But Jesus places the value of all persons in such a way as to prohibit them being objectified through lust or discarding them through divorce. Now that's the historic look at what divorce was in that era. In our day and age, we recognize that there are times that marriages go completely off the rails for one reason or another, and that the problems that are incurred can be deep and very harmful. And so we do accept that there are times when divorce is necessary. It's not the thing that anybody looks at when they first get married, that that's what's down the road. But sometimes that's the thing that can be looked at as being helpful and perhaps necessary in some situations. So that's one of the reasons why we who are in charge of looking for the welfare of those who are coming to us wanting to be married, we make sure that we sit with them and we talk with them deeply about what the marriage covenant really means between them and God, and try to forestall any kinds of problems that could lead to divorce. But even with the best of that happening, there are times when divorce may be not only the answer that has to happen, but the best answer at that moment. Now, for us as Christians, whether we are male or female, we are to treasure and nurture one another as brothers and sisters, as equals, and as worthy of honor and protection. So, in conclusion, Jesus establishes simple and profound truthfulness as being the foundation of all our interactions with each other. What Jesus asks of us, his followers, you and me both, is a complete trustworthiness in dealing with one another. What he asks is that we live lives that are utterly true, transparently honest, and dependably trustworthy. In doing so, we will be a reflection of the character of the Most Holy Trinity, who are in relationship with each other. They're never in dispute, and they never act in disregard for the value of the other. So, from the readings that we had today, I'd like to look at what Moses had to tell the children of Israel before they were to enter the promised land, a place he was not able to go with them. And with his words, I also admonish you. Choose life. To choose life is to love our God, to obey our God, and to hold fast to all that our God teaches. To choose life will make a significant difference in the shape your own life will take. To choose life is to take a stand to positively respond to God and your neighbor. To choose life is to trust in the promises of God. And indeed, that kind of a choice will make a huge difference in your life and in the lives of those around you. And so, choose life.